Well, after something of a hiatus, a long one at that, the development of Ironclad series is back. And if you're wondering, yes, at some point I will be dropping back into the 1860s and going over everybody else's Ironclads in a series of videos at some point. Obviously, some nations built enough to have their own little mini-series, and other nations will have to be grouped together all in one. In any case, many years ago when we last left off, the Royal Navy had ordered Devastation, Thunderer, and Dreadnought, although initially it was called Fury, ships which to many resemble slightly lower freeboard pre-dreadnoughts 2 decades ahead of their time. And of course, having done that, the good dumb balance was promptly restored by ordering the Cyclops class at around the same time. However, the next decade, or the following decade, the 1870s, would see what to many initially seems to be a reversion, and in some ways it actually was. The first example being the laying down in March 1873 of the Alexandra, although she was known as the Superb until almost essentially the day of her launch. She presented a little bit of a dichotomy, being at the same time a generally excellent vessel, one of the fastest and most powerful central battery ships ever built, but also being a central battery ship with a full sail rig laid down less than a month before Devastation, a mastless, sailless Ironclad, went on sea trials. A full sail rig was heavy, but it did make a central battery a better solution than turrets for that particular layout, largely because of the position of the masts. The majority of the Admiralty was actually against the idea, and they wanted to just continue to iterate and evolve on the Devastation and Dreadnought ideas, but a powerful minority forced them into the apparent step backward. They presented a number of justifications. Britain's global commitments meant that a sail-less ship was far more constrained as to where and how long it could sail. Coaling stations, of course, could be targeted for blockade, and a blockade of the enemy coast would need to be broken regularly to refuel if you didn't have sails for cruising. A sailless ship like Devastation would also be more expensive to run, since you needed to have it in steam 24/7 whilst at sea, instead of being able to shut down the engines for periods under sail. And given that big guns were needed to pierce the armour of the day, the generally low levels of accuracy for the unstabilised hand-aimed guns of the time period meant that having more guns, which a central battery could provide, might be better than just the 4 that were present on the Devastation, Thunderer, and Dreadnought each. With the additional advantage, of course, being that you were able to swing around 180 degrees to present an entirely new gun battery, as opposed to if a turret was knocked out or just jammed, you'd immediately lose half your guns and your entire ability to fire over one arc. There were, of course, counterpoints to all of these claims, but the end result was the ship in question, the Alexandra, capable of just over 15 knots and initially armed with 8 10-inch guns on her lower gun deck, 4 per side, with 3 in broadside positions and 1 aiming forward in an extended position. And then there was another pair of 10-inch and a pair of 11-inch guns on the upper, somewhat shorter gun deck, 1 of each type of gun per side, arranged at the 4 corners of the battery, with the 11-inch on the forward corners and the 10-inch on the aft corners. Outside of the main arm of Citadel, a handful of small saluting guns and 4 torpedo carriages were all that was left firepower-wise, apart from a dozen electrically detonated mines, which could be embarked if you wanted to, which gave the ship a limited ability to deploy either a defensive mine screen while you were at anchor, or to enhance its blockade capabilities. Armour was almost as complex as that armament. The lower Citadel deck was 12 inches thick at the sides, and 8 inches thick at the fore and aft bulkheads. The upper gun deck Citadel was 8 inches all around. The main armour belt ran at 12 inches from beneath the central battery aft to the end of the magazine machinery spaces, where a 5-inch thick transverse bulkhead could be found. Beyond this, aft and directly ahead of the central battery as well, the belt thinned down to 10 inches and then finally to 6 inches at the extremity of the bow and stern. The reason for the odd layout of the Citadel was the influence of the Austrian Custoza class, which had arranged a limited 8-gun main battery across 2 decks, with 6 of the guns having both broadside and fore or aft gun ports, which gave the ship a 4-gun salvo out of 8 total firing dead ahead. With ramming still in everybody's minds, the ability to bring a large amount of firepower to bear whilst closing seemed quite attractive, and so this feature was included on Alexandra. But the Royal Navy was worried about blast effects if one gun fired directly over the other, and so the lower battery had been extended outward and forward to step out the lower 10-inch gun. The somewhat rushed nature of this change was seen in the fact that this was made up of big slabs of plate, which meant that at any great speed in sea conditions other than calm, the main battery decks were essentially bludgeoning their way through the sea instead of slipping and sliding through it, which looked spectacular, but in especially bad weather, it could slow the ship significantly, and not to mention actually fighting the guns in those forward positions a little bit difficult. Alexandra would go on to have quite a successful and long career, mostly as flagship of the Mediterranean fleet. She was present for the relatively famous bombardment of Alexandria, and only left frontline duty in the early 1890s, serving on another decade as a guard ship before being placed briefly into the reserves and then being scrapped in 1908. Although oddly enough, her two main armament revisions took place in the 1890s after she was no longer serving on the front line. In 1891, the saluting guns were replaced by half a dozen 4-inch anti-torpedo boat guns, and the upper gun deck armament was replaced by 9.2-inch breech loaders. And then in 1897, the 4-inch guns were replaced by more powerful 4.7s. Shortly thereafter, in the summer of 1873, another ironclad, Temeraire, was laid down. She also carried sails, but would be referred to as the Great Brig in some quarters due to her displacing a fraction over 8,500 tons, but only having 2 masts, albeit they were rather massive ones. The main reason for this was that she represented a hybrid ship, aiming to test out a new gun mounting system that, at least in the Royal Navy, was brand new. This consisted of a small central battery with 4 10-inch guns, 2 per broadside, and a pair of 11-inch guns, 1 per side, firing ahead, and theoretically covering the forward 90-degree arc on each side. This 6-gun battery had an 8-inch side plating and bulkheads, and was further divided internally by a 5-inch bulkhead that separated the 11-inch and 10-inch guns. The main belt was 11 inches thick over the machinery, thinning down to 9 inches and then to 6 inches as you headed forward, and 9 inches down to 5.5 inches aft, with a 5-inch bulkhead aft of the aft magazine 1 deck down. Where things got interesting was the presence of an armoured deck. A flat slab, 1.5 inches thick, capping the main belt, and a 1-inch thick iron plate above the central battery. A feature that wasn't new, but had thus far only been seen in the mastless ships. But far more interesting still was the final pair of 11-inch guns, one mounted fore and one mounted aft, installed in pear-shaped open-top barbettes. The barbette armour was 10 inches thick for the forward barbette and 8 inches thick on the aft barbette, and they had armoured ammunition hoists running from them down to the magazines. Now, open-top barbettes in 1873 weren't exactly new. The French had been using them for quite some years by now, but what made Temeraire's special was the combination of the barbette itself, which in an era of mostly horizontal fire offered protection against most incoming fire without the need for a heavy and expensive roof as found in a turret, or indeed a complex heavy and expensive turntable, since only the gun needed to be turned as opposed to all the armour plate as well, again as per a turret. But the barbette was combined with a variant on the disappearing mount, so beloved of period coastal defences. This was the reason for the pear shape, as once the gun fired, it flipped itself over 180 degrees and lowered itself, coming to rest upside down and pointing backwards relative to its target. It would then be rotated to face the elongated portion of the barbette, and here a hoist and rammer would reload the gun, which would then pop back up again to fire once more, after having also obviously flipped itself 180 degrees again. This gave the crew better protection than the French barbettes, as in theory they could just stay down beneath the armour, except of course for the man in charge of aiming the gun, who had to pop his head up above the parapet to use the sighting system, although at least his sighting system was rifle and splinter-proof. However, this innovation would not be carried forward for two main reasons. Firstly, the growing deployment of rapid-fire small-caliber weapons like Gatling guns and Nordenfeldts in the fighting tops of Ironclads meant that the open roof of a barbette was now far more exposed to automatic small-caliber fire if an enemy ship managed to get close enough than was heretofore the case. And secondly, although the general concept of the barbette saved weight, as we discussed, the inclusion of the disappearing mount mechanism actually pushed the weight and space needed significantly above that of a regular turret. Dreadnought, for example, could carry a pair of 12-inch guns in a turret that was ever so slightly smaller than the barbettes which were found on Temeraire, and of course those barbettes only carried a single 11-inch gun each. Indeed, Temeraire herself carried an increasing number of small-caliber guns for anti-torpedo boat and deck-raking work over her career, along with a pair of torpedo launchers. She was relatively swift, capable of making between 13 and 14 knots on the average day, and was quite agile. She would spend most of her life in the Mediterranean, entering the reserves in the early 1890s, and eventually losing much of her rig, before becoming a depot ship and floating workshop, and being renamed first as part of the Indus flotilla, and then specifically renamed to Akbar to free up her original name, Temeraire, and she would serve on in this role as Akbar for a couple more decades, only being scrapped in 1921. We now enter a period that covers the middle of the 1870s. During this time, the Royal Navy received relatively little funding and thus built fewer ships. In part, this was because French warship production, at least on the capital ship scale, had pretty much ceased as the country tried to recover from the Franco-Prussian War. But the other major element was a changing government, and the new government tried to cut spending everywhere it could. Now, in pure monetary terms, the amount that was voted each year for the Navy didn't actually change, but of course, with inflation and the ever-rising cost of more complex ships, this meant this was a real-term cut. These measures remained in place even when the French started to rebuild the Marine Nationale in the latter part of the 1870s, and the purse strings were only really opened again in 1878, when there was another Russian war scare. Now, at the same time, there were a number of innovations taking place both within and without the Royal Navy, which meant that the Ironclads we're going to look at now will cover some of the largest guns the Royal Navy ever put to sea, touch on massive advancements in ship design, and also see the first of new forms of armour come into play. Now, the first ship on our list is the armoured cruiser Shannon, the first such vessel in Royal Navy service. Laid down in September 1873, she still carried a full sailing rig, but unlike capital ships, there was no real disagreement that cruisers, which might be sent overseas to distant stations for years at a time, would definitely need a full sail rig to keep them active for as long as humanly possible. She was originally classed as a second-class battleship, though, which is why she's on this list, a designation which normally would fall on older ships that were just not seen as viable on the front lines anymore. Very occasionally through history, as in this case, specific ships would be built as second-class vessels from the start, as the second-class battleship was seen as a good flagship for a distant posting like the China or South Africa stations. At just under 5,400 tons, she was actually substantially better protected than many ironclads of the first half-decade of the existence of the type, with an 8 to 9 inch thick main belt, tapering down to 6 inches aft, but stopping just after the foremast with a 9-inch bulkhead. But even this armour, which was twice as thick as Warrior's armour, was by now not seen as viable on the front lines of a European war, only really suitable for the lesser ships it was presumed would be encountered in far distant waters. Her armament was also unusual. There were a pair of 10-inch guns mounted up front, able to fire from dead ahead to just about on the broadside, and these were in their own small 8 to 9 inch thick armoured citadel 2 decks above the belt. Also on this level, but out in the open, were 6 9-inch guns, 3 per side, on the broadside. Against smaller foes, these could be fought normally, but against larger ones, the guns would be loaded and aimed, but then the ship would charge into ram, firing, of course, the forward 10-inch guns on its way in, and the 9-inch gun crews would retreat into the larger 10-inch guns' armoured section. Then, if the ramming attempt failed, the 9-inch broadside would be fired remotely as the two ships passed, using electrical contacts. One last 9-inch gun lived under the poop deck amidships and was able to be used in a variety of openings to fire either to one side or the other, or astern. As with all ironclads of this period, there was of course also a ram. Therefore, the ship's citadel actually contained no armament, as it was there purely to protect the machinery, the magazines, and to provide reserve buoyancy. This main citadel was augmented by the first protected deck in Royal Navy service, what we might call a turtleback layout later on. This was 3 inches thick forward of the citadel and had coal stuffed on top of it, and then there was a 1.5 inch thick flat deck over the citadel itself. The idea was that the 3-inch protected deck forward of the citadel would suffice to keep the ship from being hauled below the waterline, and thus, in theory, save weight as compared to having to extend the belt all the way forward. Shannon was, however, a case of trying to do too much with far too little. At just over 12 knots, she would only ever catch an enemy cruiser if they happened to come to her or suffered some kind of catastrophic breakdown, which made the Shannon a decent harbour protection ship for overseas stations, but pretty useless as a general patrol vessel. Although she received a few torpedoes and some machine guns later in life, she spent a brief career mainly protecting ports before being placed in reserve in 1893 and being sold for scrap in 1899, a rare example of a British ironclad that was actually scrapped before Fisher got his hands on them. The next year, 1874, there was an attempt to fix these issues with the Nelson and Northampton. These ships were 40% larger than Shannon, and they restricted the citadel to guns and machinery only, now with 3-inch protected decks at the waterline both fore and aft. This allowed the main citadel to be 9 inches thick for its whole length above the waterline and dropping down to 6 inches beneath the waterline, with 2 armoured gun positions like Shannon's forward one fore and one aft, each containing a pair of 10-inch guns, which were capable of firing a beam round to either ahead or astern as appropriate, as well as 8 single 9-inch guns providing dedicated broadside firepower. Although this time they were enclosed above themselves by a wooden deck, they were still otherwise unprotected from the sides. There was an armoured bulkhead which divided the 9-inch guns into 2 batteries of 4, which gave a total of 4 separate self-contained gun sections once you accounted for the bulkheads dividing off the 10-inch guns. Various light guns for anti-torpedo boat work and a pair of small torpedo boats were also included, and the additional size meant that they could get more powerful machinery in as well, making the ships capable of 13 to 14 knots. This wasn't much faster than Shannon and still slower than most of their sensible prey, but they could at least outrun the majority of actual full-scale ironclad battleships in service in various foreign navies. Steel plating was also used for parts of the hull as opposed to the more traditional iron. Northampton, whose main achievement in life was that, to be fair, she did look very good, never really left home waters, leaving frontline service for good in 1894 and being used as a training ship for a little while until being scrapped in 1905. Nelson had a more active life. She spent much of the 1890s on the Australia station, taking over from the previous ship of that name, which had started life as a 3-decker and then been cut down a number of times and by this point was a single-deck frigate. She was taken into the reserves in the 1890s and would last another 2 decades as a stoker's training ship, finally being scrapped in 1910. But there was to be one ship at the other end of the scale which had an incredibly convoluted backstory. It begins over in the Mediterranean, with French naval construction in the first half of the 1870s mainly focusing on smaller ships. The relatively new Italian state was worried. In a potential future war, they thought larger numbers of relatively otherwise unremarkable French ships might easily overwhelm the odd collection of vessels they'd inherited from the former states of the Italian peninsula and some early flirtations with state-ordered ironclads, especially since the Regia Marina hadn't really done all that much since the Battle of Lissa, except to patch up the survivors of said battle and order a pair of relatively small central battery ships that were more about economy than fighting power. But then in the early 1870s, the Regia Marina did a sensible thing. They concluded that there was no way they could match the French ship for ship, so they decided to go for quality over quantity. Handed this brief, the genius that was Benedetto Brin had the Duilio and Dandolo laid down in 1873. Although not displacing much more than Warrior at normal load, these ships were relatively fast for the time at about 15 knots, and they would end up carrying a monstrous 21.5-inch thick belt over an admittedly small amidship citadel, and would come to the fight, eventually again, with a trio of small torpedo tubes and 4 gigantic 17.7-inch guns, a gun caliber that only 3 ships in history would ever exceed. The Royal Navy, as we've seen, was happy to mount a mixture of 9, 10, 11 and 12-inch guns on its ironclads, largely because they saw that if they simply went for bigger and bigger guns with each subsequent class, they made their own recently built ships obsolete, which reduced the effective advantage granted by the UK's industrial output. But British gun manufacturers, who appeared to live in forge-fire-lit labs dreaming only of a gun large enough to take out the moon, had been advertising significantly larger weapons for quite some time. And the 100-ton gun, as the 17.7-inch was known at the time, would finally have a buyer. Initially, Brin had aimed for 12-inch guns, essentially trying for a faster version of the Dreadnought with better seakeeping. But when Armstrong had offered him a 50-ton gun of about 15-inch caliber, he'd seen this as a way to future-proof his ships against other possible advances. As the ship was under construction and the 100-ton gun became available, he jumped on that as well. This isn't to say the Italian ships were an entirely unqualified success, as the 17.7-inch at sea had a rate of fire that might charitably be described as glacial, and enough of the ship was unprotected that it could in fact be sunk if you never broke the citadel. But on paper, at least, they were horrifically powerful, and as the leading naval power, whose pride was its Mediterranean fleet, Britain had to respond. Realising that the only answer could be another turret ship, the Admiralty looked at a number of plans. Using Dreadnought, which was still known as Fury at that point, as a baseline, with 12-inch 35-ton guns in 2 twin turrets, based on the information they had at the time, which initially was for the 15-inch armed version of the Duilio, they came up with Option A, which was to reduce the belt on Dreadnought to a citadel only instead of full length, put in transverse armour bulkheads, and the overall saved weight could be used to improve protection a little bit. Option B was to add an amidships turret with a single 15-inch 50-ton gun. Option C was to cut out most of the superstructure in exchange for a pair of 10-inch guns in barbettes. Option D stuck 4 9-inch 12-ton guns on top of the superstructure instead, all of these retaining the 2 twin 12-inch turrets. And then Option E was radical. It dispensed with the turrets and the superstructure in exchange for no less than 10 barbette-mounted 12-inch 35-ton guns, offering a maximum broadside of 7 per side. But none of these designs really seemed viable. A minor increase to armour was going to do nothing to stop a 17.7-inch shell, and more numerous smaller guns admittedly gave a chance to sink the Italian ships outside of their armour, but they could do nothing to the Italian ship's citadel. A single 15-inch gun would have a hit rate of maybe if you roll a natural 20 when the full moon is up on an alternate Tuesday, and the 10-gun design with its exposed gun crews might be enough to beat the enemy into submission by sheer weight of fire, but it could also be disarmed in minutes by a battery of machine guns mounted in fighting tops if an enemy ship happened to get close. It was therefore clear that an entirely new design was needed, and so a fresh set of specs was drawn up, calling for a speed of 14 knots, an armament of 4 60-ton guns in 2 twin turrets, with 24 inches of armour plate, the ability to fire fore and aft with at least 2 of the guns, and the size to allow the ship to fit into the major British docks all around the Empire. For a variety of reasons, including the sheer weight of the new turrets, which were supposed to have 16 inches of armour plate, as well as the desire for maximum end on fire, and some new ideas about hull form, which were being developed and tested by one William Froude, it was decided to place the turrets en echelon amidships. As it turned out, the 60-ton gun was never actually produced, but in 1875, 1 year after the new ship was laid down, an 80-ton weapon of 14.5-inch caliber was tested. After some experiments, it was bored out considerably, and as they discovered it had been massively overbuilt, and became a 16-inch gun in the end. This was thus adopted as the new ship's main battery, and it was in part this change away from the 60-ton gun which caused the Italians to switch to the 100-ton 17.7-inch. Since the British ship could not be further modified to accommodate these even larger weapons, they were left with the 80-ton 16-inch gun. The outstanding result of all of this was HMS Inflexible. It carried a small citadel which was made up of 3 armour strakes, 20 inches thick at the top, a main strake that was 24 inches thick, and an underwater strake of 16 inches, matched by transverse bulkheads of 18, 22 and 14-inch thicknesses respectively. The turrets also showed some advancement. Although they were notionally 16 inches thick, this was made up of 9 inches of compound armour, which was a steel plate mounted to an iron plate, with another 7-inch thick iron plate behind them. Compound armour did offer better protection, but whether the laminated nature of the 2 sets of plate cancelled this additional protection out would require some rather careful calculation. A 3-inch thick deck covered the whole ship at the waterline level outside the citadel and formed the citadel roof 1 deck higher internally. The big guns were complemented by 4 torpedo launchers, 2 above water and 2 below, all mounted in the bow, and a pair of small torpedo boats were carried. The citadel had been carefully calculated to allow the ship to remain afloat and stable, even if everything outside of it was completely flooded, much as had been done with Warrior's citadel. Due to the size of the guns, the loading equipment had to be placed outside of the turrets. This was concealed under a raised section of the armour deck forward of the starboard turret and aft of the port turret. For a ship that was more floating iron brick than boat, she made a surprising top speed of just under 15 knots on trials and proved reasonably agile. This was a product of Froude's calculations improving her hydrodynamic efficiency. She also featured a number of other innovations, anti-rolling tanks to make her a better gun platform, and the introduction of electrical power. There were, of course, downsides. The machinery spaces had to have additional ventilation installed when the designed systems left the boiler rooms an untenable oven. She was initially fitted with a brig rig, more to be in keeping with the rest of the fleet than anything else. In wartime and in much of her actual peacetime career, she would operate with it reduced or removed. The anti-roll tanks mostly didn't work, and of course her initial 800-volt direct current electrical system, which powered open arc lamps in the machinery spaces and slightly more normal bulbs elsewhere, inevitably meant that the first death by electrocution aboard a Royal Navy vessel occurred within her confines. The only real surprise being it took almost a year for someone to kill themselves from the time she was commissioned in 1881. The voltage was soon lowered to make things just a little bit safer. At the bombardment of Alexandria, under the command of the then Captain Fisher, she ended up doing more damage to herself with the blast effects of her main gun battery than was actually inflicted by the 2 incoming shells that struck her armour to precious little effect. In 1885, shortly thereafter, she was refitted with the masts removed pretty much entirely and replaced by short fighting tops. The saluting battery of 6 20-pounders was replaced by 4-inch anti-torpedo boat guns, which would then in turn be replaced by 4.7-inch guns in the late 1890s, and her frontline service ended in 1893 when she became a guard ship. She was then placed in reserve in 1897 and was sold in 1903 for scrapping. Inflexible, however, did herald something that most of the Royal Navy welcomed: the end to the full sail rig, at least for capital ships. Although she did have, as mentioned, 2 masts fitted at first, These were to have been removed in times of war, and no subsequent battleship designed for the Royal Navy from the start would have a full sail rig of any description. Although, as we'll see, there would be a few more ships that ended up under the White Ensign with a sail rig, regardless of this fact. After Inflexible came the main portion of that break that we mentioned due to lack of funding, and as a result the next ships to be laid down would be the Ajax and Agamemnon in 1876. These were not a success, being born out of that recurring theme that would be found amongst the higher-ups of various navies. When a new standard has been set, in this case Inflexible, there's an almost unstoppable instinct to demand a smaller, cheaper version and somehow expect that to work. Displacing only 70% of what Inflexible displaced, the two ships had to make do with several large sacrifices. The 80-ton guns were swapped out for 38-ton 12.5-inch guns. No torpedo launchers were installed, although a single small torpedo boat was included for. Speed dropped to 13 knots, and armour was reduced to a belt of 15 inches above the waterline and 18 inches below, with transverse bulkheads 1.5 inches thicker at those two heights. The deck was still 3 inches thick, and the turrets were arguably actually a little bit better protected than Inflexible, although the face armour was only 16 inches at the front and the sides and back were 14 inches, it was full compound plate, and thus arguably perhaps a little bit more effective. But this was massively undercut by a hidden flaw in the belt and the bulkheads. For economy reasons, their thicknesses were made up of two thinner layers of plate with 10 inches of teak placed between them, which offered much less resistance than their on-paper overall thickness might otherwise suggest. Due to the almost direct scaling down, the square-cube law worked against them, and while Inflexible was able to fight with all but its citadel flooded, these two ships suffered from the opposite. Without their ends holding the ship up, both up and upright, the citadel would flip over and sink. Having a shallow draft for their size and a wide beam relative to length, they also tended to go pretty much anywhere but in a dead straight line ahead, not only requiring the rudder to be put over quite hard to keep them in a straight line, but how much rudder you needed to use and which way the rudder needed to be pointing could, and did, randomly change with no apparent warning, making them exceptionally dangerous to sail anywhere near to. Froude was consulted, and using his new testing tanks, he determined that the ship's lines were so blunt as to generate large amounts of dead water. Exactly where the dead water occurred depended on the prevailing wind and current conditions relative to where the ship was pointing, hence the constant shifting of where you needed to have the rudder to try and correct its course. Modifications made to the model showed that a stern extension would mitigate the issue, but although this made the ships slightly safer to be around, it couldn't cure their wiggly problem entirely. As a result, the two ships lurched around the seas, colliding with other ships and various parts of the landscape, for a total of only 9 years in the case of Agamemnon and a mere 6 for Ajax, after which they were consigned to progressive levels of reserve and still being sold for scrap in Fisher's Great Purge. They were, however, notable as being the first British warships to carry a specific dedicated secondary battery, made up in this case of a pair of 6-inch guns, one mounted fore and one mounted aft, plus almost 24 smaller weapons, all of which were intended for use against targets both large and small. Then, in 1878, there was another Russian war scare. This time because Russia and the Ottomans were shooting at each other again, and there was concern that Britain might get dragged into it. 3 ships were under construction for the Ottomans in British shipyards at the time. The Pike-i-Sheref, I think, the Bordeaux Zafir, and the somewhat easy to pronounce Hamadaya. As an ostensibly neutral party, Britain couldn't hand over fully armed warships to the Ottomans while the conflict was underway, and also on the slipways there was the Independencia, which was being built for Brazil. This latter was viewed as a potential useful addition to the fleet, and so she was compulsory purchased to make up the numbers. The 3 Ottoman ships were just bought up to prevent their being handed over to the Ottomans. The first 2 Ottoman ships were both of the same design, and they were smaller coastal craft designed primarily as rams for the Black Sea. Although with a top speed of just over 12 knots, one presumes that they were to sail around in hope of either a grand battle line forcing the enemy to act at the speed of their slowest ship, or possibly they would be deployed in the middle of a battle to attack crippled ships that couldn't get away. At just under 5,000 tons, they had a very prominent ram bow, a main battery of four 25-ton 12-inch guns on an upper deck central battery which was laid out octagonally, with each gun firing through a port on a face that connected the longitudinal and transverse plates. The gun firing faces were 8 inches thick, the broadside faces were 10.5 inches thick, and it was 9.5 inches of armour for the transverse faces. The deck below was 9 inches thick and 8 inches on those same facings, with a 12-inch belt below that, which reduced to 7 inches forward and 6 inches aft, with a pair of torpedo carriages that could launch through broadside ports, one fore and one aft of the citadel on either side. This layout seemed designed to allow at least one gun to bear on a target in any given direction. This was quite useful given the deflection angle inherent in any ramming approach, or, in the event of a miss, passing manoeuvre. Renamed to Belle-Isle and Orion, they proved agile but completely unsuited for open seas and rough weather. Belle-Isle was finished first and rapidly disposed of the marginal two-masted sailing rig, as well as raising her funnels, both features being implemented on Orion while she was still on the stocks. In light of their limited capabilities, they would both have relatively brief service lives, mostly serving as guard ships, before being put in reserve in the early 1890s after about a decade in service. Belle-Isle was used as a target for the brand new lyddite shells in 1900, and after repairs she was reused for this purpose for the next few years, until in 1903 a torpedo test went a little better than expected and sank her outright. Orion had a more peaceful retirement. She was moved in 1902 to Malta to act as a depot ship for torpedo boat destroyers. Then she was moved back to the UK in 1910 to act as a store ship, being renamed to Orontes to free up the name Orion for the brand new superdreadnought. She was then scrapped in 1913. Hamadryar was a somewhat more useful vessel. At just over 9,700 tons, she was renamed Superb, and she was technically a central battery ironclad, but with a battery that was so long, she'd almost gone back to being a broadside ironclad in the manner of Warrior once again. In this case, she was armed with no less than 16 10-inch guns, 4 on each broadside, 4 at the corners of the central battery, firing at wider angles through, although somewhat off of being able to fire truly fore and aft, and the last 4 were placed one deck higher in chase positions, 2 fore and 2 aft. A small anti-torpedo boat battery and 4 torpedo carriages rounded out the armament, with a top speed of just over 13 knots. Armour consisted of 12 inches on the citadel broadside and the belt immediately underneath it. The angled citadel bulkheads were 10 inches thick. There was also a 7-inch underwater strake beneath the citadel and the belt armour amidships, which tapered to 4 inches of belt armour as you headed aft, and first to 10 inches thick and then 6 inches thick as you headed forward. Originally, the chase guns had been 7-inch weapons, but part of her adaptation to Royal Navy service included upgrading these to 10 inches for a uniform main battery. Seen as a useful ship in the Mediterranean fleet, she was modernised at the end of the 1880s with vertical triple expansion engines that granted her another 1.5 knots of speed, with all the guns outside the citadel replaced with a mixture of 6-inch, 6-pounder and 3-pounder quick-firing guns. Her sailing rig was also reduced to pole masts and fighting tops. She would spend most of the 1870s on front-line duty with the Mediterranean fleet, and after her modernisation she was used as a coast defence ship for a few years, then placed in reserve in 1894, occasionally being brought back out to make up the numbers for fleet exercises before being scrapped in 1906. And this leaves us, for this video, with one last ship. Independencia was renamed to Neptune, and as a purchase from an uninvolved country, the Brazilians, who had spent some years waiting for her to be completed, were able to name their price. They chose £600,000, almost twice the cost of the broadly similar Devastation. Indeed, the design had actually started off as Devastation, but with sails, later drifting further with the addition of a forecastle, poop deck, and more extensive superstructure, which left the turrets capable only of broadside fire, at least on paper, which robbed them of much of their utility. The resulting ship had 4 12-inch guns in a pair of twin turrets, with a loss of forward firepower made up for via a pair of 9-inch guns mounted in the bow, with half a dozen 20-pounders scattered along the stern, with more 20-pounders found elsewhere. Although these smaller guns would end up being rapidly replaced. A single torpedo carriage could be launched from a port on either side of the ship, and the citadel was 10 inches thick on the side, with 8 inches on the bulkheads, and a 12-inch belt thinning down to 10 inches and then down to 9 inches. Speed was decent at just over 14 knots, but she had a litany of issues, partially due to the masts and rigging and general top weight, and partially due to the changes made in converting her to British use, and partially again because she got stuck while launching, which stressed the hull and meant that she needed extensive repairs immediately. Blast effects from the British guns that replaced the originals, to ensure commonality in the fleet, also turned out to damage the ship so much that the charges used had to be reduced, and some genius had put a hatch in the turrets that prevented them from being turned fully broadside on, which meant that each turret could only fire in the 45-degree arc either side of bow and stern respectively, leaving the ship with 0 main gun broadside fire. The engines were the old trunk type at a time when basic compound engines were becoming the standard, and the ventilation needed to be improved, as after a trial speedrun saw the boiler room reach 163 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 73 degrees C, it became clear that that was not a tenable option. Smoke then rotted her main mast, and she was eventually left with just the fore and mizzen masts reduced down to pole masts with fighting tops atop. As a result of all the additional top weight, she rolled like a drunkard, and she achieved something no one thought possible. She had a bow wave that was even larger than that of the Bellerophon, which was known in turn for announcing its presence in the form of a large frothing mound of water that had attached sails. At a low cruising speed, the bow wave on Neptune was described as a solid wall of water 11 feet high, getting worse as she headed toward full power. After 2 years in the Channel Fleet, she was moved to the Mediterranean in the hopes that somewhat calmer seas might make her slightly less damp. But after 3 years there, she was sent home to be a coast defence ship in 1887, and she was placed in reserve in 1893 and sold for scrap in 1903, at which point she decided to exact revenge on anything in sight, breaking some of her tow lines and ramming HMS Victory, almost sinking her, before careening off to collide with HMS Hero, and then having to be wrangled away from several other prospective victims before being sent over to Germany to be broken up. And that's where we'll leave it for the moment, because in 1879 the Royal Navy would lay down the Colossus and Edinburgh, marking a very significant change, a reversion back to breech-loading guns, which started a design path that would end with the Royal Sovereigns, the very last British capital ships to be protected, at least in part, by iron armour.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.